Deputy Returning Officer trying to restore order and have people removed from the count.
It is my privilege to propose a vote to you and to all of your staff for the excellent preparations you have made, both for the count and for the conduct of the election throughout the borough. We're very grateful for the efficient way in which you have got the count through somewhat earlier than on the last occasion, and also grateful to those who spent the entire day in the polling booths. May I also say how much we appreciate the work of the police in guarding our security here and at all times. It is a great honour to be returned once again to represent the constituency of Finchley.
Not for us, it isn't.
It is a great honour for me that the citizens of Finchley have returned me once again to represent them. The only power we have in this country, in a democratic free country, is the power we draw from the ballot box. I am, of course, particularly glad to have obtained more than 50% of the votes, which is very satisfactory. May I also thank, above all, those who have supported me in my campaign for their tremendous enthusiasm, dedication and affection. Without you, it could not possibly have been done. I'm most grateful. Thank you.
Well, a domestic speech.
Jeremy Shearmer, what does the re-election of Margaret Thatcher mean for the United States?
In my judgment, there are going to be three main consequences. First of all, it will get rid of the degree of uncertainty about NATO and American bases in Britain, which have been introduced by the Labour Party's campaign. Secondly, it seems to me to mean that there will be a continuation of the expectation on the part of Britain, at least, of a special relationship with the United States, and there can be a certain degree of expectation on the part of the US government that there will be in international affairs a voice in Britain which will be generally in support of United States policy. Thirdly, but this becomes a little more uncertain, there is the element in Thatcher's approach which is looking to the United States as a model from which Britain may learn. And so in this particular respect, there's an element of flattery of the United States and also a certain degree of compatibility in ideology and outlook with the present US government.
Christopher Hitchens, same question. What does the re-election of Margaret Thatcher mean for America?
Well, it doesn't alter the fact that there is still in Britain a large majority in favour of the removal of American bases. And if the election had been on that alone, the Labour Party would have won it. It's to Labour's sorrow and chagrin that they couldn't make that the issue. If that were the issue, Jeremy would be utterly wrong. Majority of my fellow countrymen and women don't want to be an outpost of Ronald Reagan's foreign policy, which brings me to the second implication, which is after the leader of the free world and President of the United States and Chief Executive made such a complete and abject fool of himself and of your country in Venice recently.
What exactly are you referring to?
I'm referring to his inability to concentrate, to remember, to muster even the paltry knowledge of issues that an average newspaper reader would have. I mean, the same farcical incompetence that he manifests at home, that we see him towards the tail end of a disgraceful presidency. And we see in the wings this extraordinary woman who has never really accepted the idea that Britain is second-rate, in any sense of the term, and who really does, I think, begin to preen herself for the role of elder statesman of the West. And having seen a bit of it in England, I can't in any way encourage you to look forward to it spreading as a general thing.
I just like to talk a little bit about style. We just watched that clip where the Prime Minister was speaking and what we might call heckling was coming from other members of Parliament. We would find that very strange, although it does happen on occasions, not to the Prime Minister or the President. Describe that, how that works.
Well, it's very much part of the British political tradition. That's to say that there's an expectation that anyone holding a senior political position in Britain, and indeed who's in the House of Parliament, would be able to stand up and air their views in a public place would indeed expect to receive heckling and will be able to make good use of it. And there's a further carryover to that, which is that it's a feature of the British political system that Margaret Thatcher has to face question time in the House of Commons on a regular basis, as do all her cabinet, and where indeed the sort of problems concerning President Reagan to which Christopher was referring are ones which really one couldn't imagine a senior figure in British politics encountering at all, on the grounds that if someone wasn't in a position to handle such really tough questioning, they could no longer remain in office.
Does that bother them much? I mean, do they respond to those remarks, or do they just usually continue going on?
Had I been at Finchley, I would have been one of the hecklers, and I hope I'd have come up with something somewhat better than the rather sort of loutish interjections that they managed. I have in my time, I like to think, done better than that. I thought that she was able to brush it aside too much. Harold Macmillan, the most imperturbable Conservative Prime Minister since the war, said in his memoirs that he used to sometimes go and have to be sick before facing question time in the House of Commons twice a week. Nobody knew it at the time. You wouldn't have known it to look at him. That's how seriously they have to take it. I like to echo Jeremy's point about imagine Reagan having to face anything of the kind. I noticed, though, that she avoided one of the conventions of these counts, where you graciously accept your victory and thank the police and the returning officer. She completely forgot to thank her opponents for fighting a clean and decent and excellent and admirable campaign. And I must say, I fear that that's not just a portent for the future, but very much part of her present style, which is to forget that there are any other people in the country, or that there's anyone who disagrees with her.
The British election is over, and Margaret Thatcher has won an historic third term. Tonight we'll be discussing that for about the next 90 minutes. And our guests are two experts, and I guess you know by now they're both from England. Jeremy Shearmer is Senior Research Fellow now for the Institute of Humane Studies at George Mason University here in Fairfax, Virginia. And Christopher Hitchens is Washington correspondent for The Nation and The New Statesman. We'd like to first start off by talking about how big was Margaret Thatcher's victory as far as the majority, the working majority she'll have in Parliament.
Well, as I understand it, the figures that are being given at the moment is that she'll have an overall majority of between 104 and 106. This is down about 40 on what she had before. On the other hand, it was pretty clear that no one, I think, was expecting that she would get a majority quite this large. It has come to as a shock not just to pundits, but also it was pretty clear last night from shots on US television from members of her own cabinet. It will make the small loss of seats that there's been will make no practical difference at all in terms of the conduct in politics in Britain.
That is still then a good working majority?
Yeah, I think I would give it higher marks than Jeremy does. I mean, the fact is that for a woman who isn't personally popular in the opinion polls, and who's had to be Prime Minister of the country through two quite tempestuous parliaments, to get a third mandate at this level is an extraordinary achievement. It has to be granted.
If she isn't personally popular, how did she do it?
Because, and I'm sorry to keep on contrasting her to the leader of the free world, she would rather be respected than liked. My view of, for example, Ronald Reagan is he's a person who above all wishes to be loved. Thatcher doesn't care about that. She demands respect. And though you can find many people in Britain who do not like her, including a large number of members of her own party, including of her own cabinet, who personally find her detestable, you will not find anyone who thinks she's a contemptible figure or a figure of fun, and I won't push the parallel any further.
Tell me about Margaret Thatcher's government as far as her policies. We know about Ronald Reagan's policies. Describe what it's like in Britain under a Thatcher regime.
Under a Thatcher regime, there's been a deliberate attempt to try to shift Britain's institutions in the direction of a more market-based society, in the expectation that this will give more opportunity to everybody. This has been accomplished by Mrs. Thatcher in the Conservative Party from what in certain respects is not too healthy a starting point. What I mean by that is that typically Conservative supporters will be people who are not all that open to change, who certainly may be people with business background or concerns of that sort, but who wouldn't necessarily be too open to the kind of radicalism that Mrs. Thatcher's approach in certain respects espouses. What she's done, and this has been commented on from quite a wide perspective, is to have combined an appeal in the economic area of a great deal of radicalism together with a reaffirmation of traditional values, together also with a certain kind of patriotic approach in matters of foreign policy, which the Falkland Islands, I think, was particularly convenient last time for her to do. There's a very distinctive package that's been put together, and it's something which has managed to push through changes which I guess a number of people would have thought in Britain would have been pretty difficult to push through, but which really does have these three and quite distinctive elements to it.
Now, many of the things you just mentioned sound very much like Ronald Reagan's philosophies.
Yes, except that Reagan promised people instant gratification. He said everything's going to be okay, we should stop feeling bad about ourselves, we should feel good again, we should congratulate one another and ourselves all the time. And you deserve more, and I'm going to give it to you, and you won't have to pay any taxes for getting it. And you can now see the consequences of that with the deficit and with indeed the resulting summit fiasco at Venice and many other unpleasant consequences that we are, I think, not going to be very long finding out about. With Thatcher, it's been rather different. She promised people sacrifice and pain. She said the country's been rotting in mediocrity for a long time. It's been paying itself more than it can earn. I'm going to turn the cold shower on all of you. And I think she actually wouldn't have minded turning it on to everybody, but this is a class-divided country that Jeremy and I come from, and it doesn't fall on everyone. And the most vivid impression I find, returning home as I often do, is how pitiless that has been, and how people who used to be only poor are now really very poor, and how people who understood seasonal unemployment are now out of work perhaps forever, or have never had a job, and how all that kind of thing has become a great deal more severe, and social and racial and regional divisions have all become much more acute.
Jeremy, do you agree with that assessment?
I think Christopher's correct in some of what he's saying, but I'm not sure to what extent, where there are problems that he's indicated, they can really be properly held to be the responsibility of the Conservative Party. My point there really is that a number of the problems, particularly of unemployment of a structural kind in some of the British industries, which has fallen particularly heavily on some regions, is something which, as far as I can see, any government would be grappling with, and where it's really very difficult to see how, in a sense, you could do much different from what the present government has done. Granted that the present government has acted in a more precipitate way, and so certain things which might possibly have been handled more smoothly over a longer period have been faced more quickly. The difficulty was that I guess you could say that those very sectors of Britain's economy have been in a long period of decline, which started before the Second World War. They got a temporary boost from the conditions immediately after the Second World War. Problems really were never got to grips with, and it's not clear to me that it really does politically to point the finger at Mrs. Thatcher and say how terrible these things are, when it's just not clear that there really is an alternative.
We'll be taking your calls in just a few moments. The numbers will be listed throughout the show at the bottom of the screen, and it'll, like I said, we'll be taking them in about 5 minutes. Before then, we're going to run a clip of some BBC coverage from last night's election.
Let's hear the latest forecast on the basis of that, Peter.
Right, David, let's build up the forecast on the map. Here we go. The Conservatives, 351, 42. Look at them pile up there. 42 down on what they were before. The Labour Party, 249, up 40. The Alliance, 26, down 1. And the others, 24 plus 3. Let's just split the Alliance in two and see what we're forecasting currently the Liberals and the SDP will take. 18 seats, the Liberals, we say, down 1. The SDP continuing with the 8 they had in the old Parliament. The others, 24, up 3. We're forecasting the Scottish National Party wins in Scotland. Now, take a spin inside the new chamber of the House of Commons, and let's see what it looks like. There we are, inside the Commons chamber. There's Mrs. Thatcher on the government benches, through the winning post with 351. The Labour Party, Mr. Kinnock, on 249. Add all the opposition together, subtract them from the Conservatives, and you get a forecast Conservative majority now, David, of 52.
You just mentioned something about Monty Python type coverage. What do you think of that?
One thing I've noticed since the last election in Britain is the increasing dominance of British politics by what we call American type style. Opinion polls on every front page and leading every news broadcast. Computer graphics, photo opportunity politicians who never really give speeches or have press conferences. I don't think that deserves the name of American myself, because America is a thoughtful and democratic country, but the style of razzmatazz politics probably originated here too, and it's taken over even the BBC. My God, I mean, can you imagine? You know, Auntie BBC behaving like a discotheque on election night.
That coverage seemed to have a lot more emotion in it than you find on most U.S. networks.
I guess just an element of excitement. I mean, certainly one of the things that I missed being over here is really the experience of staying up and getting quite excited even at home about the progress of the release of the election figures.
Yes, it's a myth to think that the British are phlegmatic and unemotional.
Just wait till we get at one another's throats later in this.
Our first call is from Chesterton, Indiana. You're on.
Well, hi there. Well, it looks like the left wing is in trouble all over. They're having their problems here, too. And I see that, Chris, you're in such a snit, you know, about Maggie. And I suppose we can expect you to be even more brattish than usual this evening. Anyway.
Do I know you?
Elegant
You seem to know me.
Well, what I really did want to ask a question. You know, we have a party here in this country called, what is it? Oh, Democratic Socialists. We have several of them in our Congress on the Democratic side. Do you suppose those are social Democrats? Sort of a reverse English there, but they sound very much the same. They're not identified here as in your country. You see, we really do have three parties. It's assiduously avoided whenever this is mentioned. I think I see nothing wrong with three parties, but I think it's rather has not really sinister overtones, but childish overtones, shall we say.
Thank you very much, caller.
Well, the Democratic Socialists of America doesn't have the resources to run in election campaigns. But you're right in saying that a number of board members of the AFL-CIO and a number of members of Congress, including quite a number of members of the Black Caucus, for example, will come to a DSA convention or will endorse a DSA motion for debate at the Democratic Convention. What the DSA says it's like is like the Labour Party was in Britain about 70 years ago. That's to say, the Labour wing of the Liberal Party. It took a very long time before they built up enough strength to declare a Labour Party on their own, and I think it'll take, well, it won't be a short time, at any rate, before the Democratic Socialists of America are able to do the same.
Martinez, California, you're on.
Yes, Martinez, California.
Martinez, okay, sorry. Go right ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to know if you think there might be any long-term effects towards the weapon discussions that will be coming up in Europe. And a second question, do you think that England may be more likely, than they have in the past, to back up the United States in its foreign policy decisions, such as last year's attack in Libya and the oil situation in the Persian Gulf?
Okay, I'll kick off on that if I may. First of all, in terms of weapons, I'd like to go back to some of the opening comments that Chris was making, because I think that he's quite right that there is much less enthusiasm in Britain for nuclear weapons, for the prospect of threats of their use and so on, than is common certainly in some of the media in the United States, and that while the Conservative Party certainly has fought on a program of retaining US bases, and they're also committed to continuing the orders for Trident weapons in Britain. I think that even there, that even within the ranks of the Conservative Party, and particularly amongst younger people, there's a much greater willingness to look very seriously at issues of disarmament than will be common in the United States. So that to come directly on this matter to the first part of the question, I think that it would be wrong to take the kind of endorsement that one got through the British election of the Conservative Party's policies as being gung-ho support for American lines on this. And certainly I don't think that while one will get a complete endorsement of, for example, all the current administration's moves in the Middle East. Even the most conservative and even the most bellicose of people in Britain look pretty moderate if put up against some of the people on the right in the United States.
The Labour Party was for unilateral disarmament,
Yes.
nuclear weapons.
The Labour Party would have made Britain nuclear-free in its defence policy, which would mean two things in our case. It would mean, first, removing your bases, if I can call them that. You didn't have a chance to vote for them being there, and nor did we, but so let's say they are USAF bases from British soil. And it would also involve giving up the pretense that Britain could independently have a nuclear war with the Soviet Union on its own, which is a pretense we currently, and at great cost, maintain. I thought that the connection made by the questioner between the Libya raid and the bases was a good one, and I'll just say this about it. The reason why public opinion in Britain was so strongly against that participation, British participation in the Libya raid last year, was this, and it surprised many people how large the repudiation was. Until the raid took place, not many British people knew how many American bases there were in Britain. It's not usually discussed by the government how many there are, and weren't aware that the United States could launch a strike on another country using British territory, with Parliament and the press being unaware of it. And since that realization has deepened, if you will, extended, people have begun to ask, well, when did we sign this agreement? When was the treaty? When did Parliament vote to have all this? And found, of course, that there was never any such decision democratically validated. And that's not going to go away as an issue in Britain, no matter who is Prime Minister.
Are those bases shared bases?
No, they're USAF bases.
Just United States. Okay. Let's go to Burbank, Illinois. You're on. Burbank, you there? I guess not. Labor said during this election, I believe, that there was an ever-widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. Can we expand on that a little bit?
Yes, I'll address it to start off with, if I may. There have certainly been shifts in the distribution of income in Britain. Quite what significance one's to read into them, I think, isn't too clear. Why do I say that? Well, basically, the strategy behind the Conservative government in Britain is to try to shift Britain into a system which will generate wealth better, which will give incentives, and we're certainly on the part of the Conservative government. There's a strong belief that you'll get a trickle-down effect from moves in that direction. And in addition, there is the belief that it was important to do something pretty radical to redress the slow relative economic decline that Britain has been suffering over quite a long period of time. Now, I think there was a great deal of self-conscious awareness about the fact that if one was going to make a more market-based society work effectively, this would involve a greater degree of economic inequality. But, and here is the big but, the argument was that once this had run for a bit, one would get benefits which could be spread more widely through the community, and that one would then actually have wealth to help those people who couldn't help themselves. So what I would want to do very much on this is, on the one side, to bite the bullet and say, yes, there is, in certain respects, a deliberate decision to go for a form of social organization which has a greater degree of inequality in it, but where this is seen as being an engine for the production of other things that are worthwhile. I want to relate these two things together such that, if Chris possibly says that the inequality that's involved in making such a move is unacceptable, I'd be interested to see whether there is some other engine which could be hoped to generate the more positive consequences.
Well, for now, all I'd like to say is, and draw to the attention of the audience, is this, that, and Jeremy deserves credit for being frank about it, and so does Mrs. Thatcher. What makes Thatcher a Thatcherite is not that she accepts the fact that Britain is ruthlessly divided by class and income, and also wealth ownership, very highly stratified way, and always has been, but that she self-consciously praises the idea of inequality. That is new. That is also why she's so widely disliked, but it's also why she deserves credit, in my opinion, because she doesn't pretend that it can or should, in her own view, be otherwise. And that's what we talk about when we mean Thatcherism. So I think that's a baseline at which to stop till we get another question.
Can I come back on this?
Well,
Because I think that on the topic of inequality, one's got to distinguish between inequality for its own sake and inequality of a sort which, it's argued, will emerge in a well-working market-based economy. Now, I mean, certainly there are all kinds of forms of inequality that one may get in many, many places, which Mrs. Thatcher and I would guess most of the people in the Conservative Party who favour her views really aren't very keen on it at all. I mean, some of the people who are more keen on a paternalistic interpretation of conservatism would like certain other kinds of inequality, but where possibly traditional landlords would have the job of looking after their retainers, who, in return for touching their forelocks, would then be looked after a bit. There's been a deliberate move to grasp an attempted solution to Britain's problems. And I think that it isn't really enough just to stop by saying, these things have undesirable features to them. Sure, but the situation that Britain is in has undesirable features. Consider, I mean, if you went from, both of us are relatively young, but I think within the lifetime of both of us, if one went to countries on the continent of Europe when we were young, one would be struck by them being in various ways kind of quite charming but a bit decrepit. If one goes abroad into Europe now, including the north of Italy, one is struck by the fact that here one has got sort of affluence of a kind which really only is to be found in little bits of Britain at the moment, and where certainly the whole gamut of policies that have been tried before by the Conservative and Labour Party hadn't got anywhere. Thatcher, at least, has been trying a solution to these things, and if that is rejected, I think what one needs to hear is what really is the workable alternative.
Next call is from San Diego. You're on.
On the right, the protection of our economy and the private enterprise system, the evidence every day is enough to make you want to vomit. I mean, it's sickening. But also on the left, and the socialists, you look at it for 70 years, there's no emphasis on any entrepreneurial opportunities for those people. Why do they just persist in staying in the same kind of ideas? You go to a socialist to solve any kind of a problem, they never have any new ideas. It's almost like they're bankrupt since 1917. And everything they've ever tried really has failed. They have to come back and use capitalistic ideas. Why can't they create some new kind of an economic system that really does work? Well, I never see any sincere effort in this behalf. And so I keep rejecting it. I know that wealth, you feel a sense of, when you see the ostentatious display of wealth, it's sickening, and I think that's why most socialists turn away from it. But also, there's just no ideas. I can see there's no way that you can find love and happiness in the socialist system. There's just no way that if you're not on the inside of the movement, you can't get in. They have a bureaucracy that just blocks you out at every turn. It's a hopeless situation. I'd like to see, Shaw said that youth is wasted on the young. Christopher, so far, I tend to agree with him.
I agree with him too, especially since I'm nearer 40 than 30 now. I mean, I'm happy to take that as a comment, but insofar as it was a question, I think it was to me, and I'd say this about it. Britain, since 1945, has been a very, very heavily state-run economy, but also very, very capitalist one. And another point of interest about Thatcherism has been this, that she believes that Britain has been, in a sense, a socialist collectivist society, really since Churchill ceased to be Prime Minister in 1945. Now, the fact that that's a nonsensical opinion and doesn't fit with any known fact or any known theory doesn't quite rob it of its power, because it's certainly true that there was a lot of inefficient public ownership, a great deal of what I would call craft unionism, trade unions simply acting as syndicates for the protection of members, what you might call on the waterfront trade unionism in some cases. And a great presumption of subsidy in the case of any business that ever got into trouble. And most of that under Conservative governments. It was the Conservatives, for example, who nationalized Rolls-Royce, which was very symbolic in the early 1970s. Thus, one has to say that at least in theory, Thatcher does believe that everybody should take their chances and believes in meritocracy rather than in hierarchy and so forth. But I regard that as basically for public consumption. I think you will find, in fact, that the tax breaks that she's given to those who already are well off and to the businesses that are already in place haven't been rewarded by further investment.
Could I come back on that?
Sure.
I'd like to make two comments. First of all, one thing which is, I think, extremely depressing to many people in Britain is the way in which many people are cut off from the opportunity of using their own initiative. It's really pretty grim, the way in which, in a sense, if people haven't been at the right place at the right point of time with the right qualifications, they don't really have a second chance, and the way in which within many different enterprises, especially large state-run enterprises, but this kind of ethos has carried over to a considerable extent into private business in Britain. If someone shows initiative, if they're a little bit old, if they haven't come in with the right sort of qualifications, then there's really no hope for them. And certainly one thing which I think has been extremely striking about the activities of the Conservatives under Thatcher has been a wish to try to break with these very deep-seated institutions and patterns in Britain.
Yes,
and it's something which is extremely difficult to do, but where certainly they have grasped this particular nettle in a way in which no one else has done.
Jim, I don't know if you're going to show any of the Labour spokesmen as
We
go
are
on,
in just a few minutes.
But let me just say, because now might be the time to say it, it's very striking. Neil Kinnock made a video for this campaign. Labour had never tried any of this
That's
stuff
the Labour
before.
leader.
Yeah, Neil Kinnock, the Labour leader. Made a video of a kind Labour had never tried before, and this, for some reason, had a tremendous effect. It moved him 14 points up in the opinion polls the morning after it was shown. And the high point of this 10-minute video is him giving a speech in Wales to a working-class audience and saying, "Why am I the first member of my family ever to go to university? Why is my wife the first member of my family, of her family, ever to go to university? We come from 1,000 generations of workers and soldiers and poets and games players and artisans and craftsmen. Was it because we were thick? No, it wasn't because we were thick. Was it because we were lazy? It wasn't because we were lazy. Was it because we were weak? No, it wasn't. And it was because we never had a platform. We never had a party. We never had the money. We never had any of the advantages that necessitate a simple thing like higher education." Now, the fact that in Britain, in 1987, an appeal like that can have such a tremendous effect on public opinion, so many people recognizing themselves in such an appeal, is a tremendous condemnation of the way our society is organized. People know they've been wasted. They saw their parents' lives squandered with no opportunity, no advantage, for class reasons. And that still remains the most salient fact about our country. And I therefore think that Thatcher's dealing in illusion, saying that she hopes to abolish the socialist idea.
But the sad thing is that it's the very kind of institutions which the Labour Party has then moved towards historically, and for which, as far as I can see, there's been no real indication that if they got in, they'd be wanting to move away from, which has just served to cement people into the kind of traps that they had been in. I mean, granted, everyone, I mean, I say everyone, I mean, it's really rather nice that the Labour Party has at least come around to recognising the problem. What they don't seem to have understood is that the way in which they'd been conducting affairs in Britain really, in many ways, constituted the problem. I mean, certainly there are many features of the policies of the present Conservative government which are tough, which do seem pretty ruthless, but it is a radical attempt to get to grips with exactly these problems, whereas the problem on the other side, and in terms of all that the Labour Party was projecting, was that it's as if, yes, they're big problems, and we care about them and we will do something, and where what was actually then going to be done was either not too clearly specified, or where it was, it looks as if it was going to end up putting power back behind exactly the same kind of traditional institutions particularly in terms of the trade union movement in Britain, which in many ways, and I think from some of the remarks you've been making, pretty much everyone accepted had been a major cause of these problems.
Let's go up, if we can, to New England, Newton, Massachusetts. You're on.
Hi, thank you very much. I'd like to ask Chris Hitchens two questions. And by the way, he's not a snit. He writes very insightful comments in his Nation column. My two questions are, do the British election results reflect the continuation of an irreparable North-South division in the country? And will the fact that Mrs. Thatcher failed to gain a majority, only a plurality, increase the demands from the Alliance and the Labour Party for electoral reform away from single-member districts to proportional representation? Thank you.
North-South divides certainly become the great emerging theme of British demography, and obviously a glance at the map makes it very dramatic. An old friend of mine won a seat last night for the first time, a Labour seat in Sunderland, which is a declining shipbuilding town on the northeast coast. The Conservative candidate in Sunderland didn't hold his deposit, which means he got by basically 1,000 votes in the whole town. And my friend Chris Mullin, former editor of Tribune, and the man to watch, by the way, increased the Labour majority in Sunderland by something like 18%. Now, those votes might as well not have been cast. This is just a working-class town that wouldn't vote Tory to save its life, but where those votes simply go to elect one more MP. If there was proportional representation, you'd get a quite different spread of votes and seats across the country. And I do think that given now that Scotland and Wales hardly elect anyone for the governing party, which has more or less supreme power in the chamber, and that the third party has not got seats in proportion to its vote at all, does strengthen the case for proportional representation on national grounds. Unfortunately, there's something in the British temper, which I don't totally disagree with, that's against the idea of fudging the choice, that quite wants to have a clear winner and a clear outcome and a clear decision-making choice, and that will never take the Italian option of a bunch of small parties who, after the election, then get together and fix it in smoke-filled rooms, no more democratic. So though it's fair to say that on the extreme left, Arthur Scargill of the Miners' Union is for proportional representation, and on the centre-right, people like Roy Jenkins are for it, that it still just doesn't kindle the fire in the national psyche, mixing the metaphor. See what I mean?
Jeremy?
If I can come in on this, first of all, the North-South divide. It is there and it is real. It is, though, a little bit patchy. Certainly, a friend of mine, Michael Fallon, was returned with a slightly diminished majority, but a very small majority in a northern town of Darlington, and there have been other such cases. What is, I think, noticeable, and when talking to Fallon, I found this out about his own scouting around in the northeast, is the extent to which people there have indeed been people who have been preserved in their jobs in typically either the government sector or in heavy manufacturing industry, which has been helped out by government. And one consequence of this has been that even in areas of extremely high unemployment, when there's been the opportunity through various government schemes to encourage people to start up businesses in a small way, it's had comparatively negligible take-up there. As to say, it seems to me that the problem that is in part being reflected in the North-South divide is an entire culture which has been created in some areas of the north of England, such that outside of certain traditional, but I think inevitably declining forms of industry, inevitably declining because these are ones which newly industrializing countries are going to be coming into competition with, people's initiative has in a sense been sapped. And while certainly it's a big job to consider, and it's difficult even to consider quite what government policies can do to assist this, I'm not at all sure that a policy, say, of responding to distress in the north of England by essentially more of the same, more of what has really created the problem, is going to help. As to proportional representation, I think that Chris is right on this, with one possible exception, which is that proportional representation is typically something that any third party in Britain will say is really a marvelous idea, but it works to the advantage of the two large, the first past the post system in Britain works to the advantage of the two large parties in Britain, so that they would be highly unlikely to agree to make any move, even if they're on the losing side, because they do pretty badly out of it. Another element to it is that insofar as both within the Conservative Party and within the Labour Party, you have people who take the view that some quite radical action is needed to address Britain's problems, then they also are going to shy away from a system which would be likely to ensure that no action that departed in any dramatic way from what's already been done would be taken.
We have a clip from the Labour Party, one of the Labour Party leaders, last night, and we'd like to see that now.
You and Mr. Kinnock are dubbed the dream ticket. Doesn't the dream look as if it's turning into a bad dream?
Don't lose the cliche altogether. The nightmare is the phrase you're stumbling for. It depends what the result is. I think Mr. Kinnock and me, principally Mr. Kinnock, ran our first-class campaign. We've re-established the Labour Party, whatever happens tonight, as a great national party. People who were talking, 6 years about the death of the Labour Party and dancing on our grave aren't talking about that anymore. The alliance has passed into political oblivion. Whatever happens tonight, the Labour Party is there and is the alternative government to this country.
You agree with that?
No, I don't. And actually, the sight of Roy Hattersley's face reminds me of all the reasons I wanted to leave England 7 years ago. He has to say that, of course. The fact is, look, the Labour Party has lost 3 successive elections without a shadow of doubt as to the result. I mean, 3 crushing defeats on the trot from a woman who was derided when she first became leader of the party as a right-wing extremist and as a throwback to what she herself has since called Victorian values. Rightly is she so derided. But she has found something in the British electorate that Labour, try as it may, and it fought as near to a non-political campaign as it could, can't replicate. Now that's a serious defeat, and for Hattersley to pretend otherwise is completely ridiculous.
I thought part of what he mentioned, though, is he re-established the Labour Party at the expense of the alliance, the third party.
However, but he in a sense gives himself the lie by talking about 3 parties. The fact is that by conceding that there is now a 3-party system, he's admitting that Labour can't even mobilize all the anti-Tory vote, which it used to be able to do effortlessly. And if there are 3 parties in Britain, Labour can never be a majority government. And so I think Mr. Hattersley is whistling.
Jeremy, would you like to add anything?
Yes, if I could. I think that one feature of the Labour Party's campaign was that they picked up quite a lot of votes that most of us were expecting would go to the alliance. It was especially in, for example, these commercials with Kinnock and his wife dancing over the cliff tops in a way not unlike your president and his wife in previous such films that attracted the attention of an interest of these people. Now, in a way that's quite symptomatic, and it relates to a point that Hattersley was making. That's to say, the Labour Party has faced a difficulty over the period gradually going on since 1945. What is that? Well, it is really that in Britain, political attitudes and voting behavior are dictated in many ways by people's socioeconomic status, the kind of jobs in which they're employed, and so on. And the Labour Party is in this respect unlucky that there has been an undermining of its own natural base, of those people who really without thought would vote for the Labour Party because they identified it with themselves. Now, since 1945, there's been a gradual process of destabilization of such knee-jerk electoral support. And this has been something which gradually the Liberal Party has picked up, which when the Social Democrats joined them, they just simply continued. I mean, there was no sort of big boost, really. It was simply a continuation of a trend that was there. But these people are drawn more typically from right across the socioeconomic spectrum. And they, I guess, also will be people who might be rather more responsive to the kind of pitch that the Labour Party made. Thus, it did, certainly the Labour Party didn't do particularly well, but it did rather better than one might have expected. But I wouldn't have even been particularly sanguine about getting those votes and that sort of support if I were a member of the Labour Party. Why? Because it was support of a rather different kind from that which I depended on previously. And unless the Labour Party itself were willing really to turn its back on its roots and on its firmly held ideological beliefs and make a pitch for the kind of territory that the Liberals and the Social Democrats have got in Britain, I think it would be very difficult for them to retain the support of those people.
Let's go to Portland, Oregon. You're on.
Hi. By the way, Mr. Hitchens, I think you're wrong about the bases in England. If it's anything like our arrangement with Germany, they're carried on your list as your bases, but occupied by Allied forces. I don't know. You'd have to check the status of forces agreement, but I think you'll find that's the case. What really stuns Americans is when you tell them, well, you know, Americans are not responsible for security of their bases overseas. And this inevitably draws a very long blank stare. And you have to point out the host government is responsible for security. So at Lakenheath or Cheddar and Ham on Rye or wherever it is they happen to be, that's why you're going to see nothing but bobbies out there with the demonstrators. Your government's obliged to provide that security. But on to my question. About NATO, I didn't find Mr. Kinnock's proposal all that strange. I thought it was perhaps a little premature, because I do tend to think of NATO as being something that is subject to centrifugal forces. That is, over time, unless there's a countervailing force, there will be a tendency for it to kind of fall apart. Where do you see it going if we assume that the Gorbachev initiatives really are leading to ultimately a mutual and balanced force reductions and the more overt kinds of threats that we think of when we think of a need for NATO gradually disappear?
To your first point, I didn't mean to imply that the American bases in Britain are like, say, the American base in Cuba, that they're part of United States territory and that the government there has no control over them. And as far as I know, the Guantanamo base in Cuba is the only example of that. And clearly they remain British soil, but they are not under British control any more than the cruise and Pershing missiles are. And there was never a treaty, as there is with other countries in which American bases are cited, nor was there ever a debate in Parliament about it. And it is this that fuels much of the protest. So, if I wasn't sufficiently clear about that before, I hope I am now. As for NATO, I think you're not quite persuasive in contrasting it with the EEC. There is, in fact, a two-tier
economic community. Being a peaceful economic association, there is a tendency for forces to bring the various countries closer and closer together, which of course causes some elements of various countries to feel very squeezed, and there's a lot of political problems, I guess, there. I was just wondering, in terms of NATO, where do you see it going if we assume that the Gorbachev initiatives really are leading to ultimately a mutual and balanced force reductions and the more overt kinds of threats that we think of when we think of a need for NATO gradually disappear?
To your first point, I didn't mean to imply that the American bases in Britain are like, say, the American base in Cuba. That they're part of United States territory and that the government there has no control over them. And as far as I know, the Guantanamo base in Cuba is the only example of that. And clearly they remain British soil, but they are not under British control any more than the cruise and Pershing missiles are. And there was never a treaty, as there is with other countries in which American bases are cited, nor was there ever a debate in Parliament about it. And it is this that fuels much of the protest. So, if I wasn't sufficiently clear about that before, I hope I am now. As for NATO, I think you're not quite persuasive in contrasting it with the EEC. There is, in fact, a two-tier European economic community that's partly symmetrical with a two-tier NATO. southern European countries such as Greece, Turkey, which isn't yet quite in the EEC, and Italy, have always had a rather more fractious relationship with the NATO alliance, partly because they really are nothing to do with the North Atlantic than the North Atlantic powers have. I think you're right, though, that there is a fissile tendency in the alliance. What I think it is one that has a more Western European consciousness and that hopes to create, in the end, a Europe that can defend itself and that doesn't need to be at the mercy of either superpower. Now, in his admittedly vague and sometimes rather romantic way, that's what Mr. Kinnock is proposing. Mrs. Thatcher here is caught between two stools. She's not much of a European and never has been, and particularly has never been able to have a good alliance with France. But she's neither happy about the apparently automatic subordination of the United Kingdom to the United States in foreign and defense policy. And to revert to a question we were asked earlier, I think that in a year or so, when she becomes, when your president leaves office, the senior European statesman, one might find, paradoxically, that it would be the Tories that would chart a more independent and European course for the country. And that'll be very interesting if it does occur.
It seems to me to be, and if I can just speak personally on this matter, to be something extremely attractive about the idea of Western Europe becoming gradually responsible for its own defense. This, I think, would have, in the longer term, defusing consequences on the international scene, because measures which the United States may be taking in the defense of the West as a whole can, I think, very often look rather threatening. Whereas if Western Europe were involved essentially with defensive measures just for itself, then it would be rather more difficult for anyone else to picture these things as being aggressive. The difficulty about that is the cost of it. I mean, that's to say that the problems facing Europe outside of an American umbrella is who is going to pay for all of this stuff. One of the problems, I think, facing Kinnock is the following. Suppose that he had been returned on the declared policy. The first thing one must ask is, what would actually have happened? Would it really have been the case that America would have been asked to withdraw its bases? Would this have actually taken place? I'm a bit skeptical about that. But then suppose that it were. Kinnock and any other Western European government involved in this situation of really having to stand on its own feet would be faced with doing what? Well, either keeping its own nuclear forces as a going concern, and this is something that Britain has done, the Tories are identified with it, but it's frighteningly expensive. Or what? Conventional forces? If one looks at conventional forces in Britain, the cost of getting these up to a realistic level as compared to the USSR is quite phenomenal, and also would lead to enormous difficulties. Why? Because Britain doesn't have any form of conscription. What is one going to do? Pay for comparable numbers of people who are going to be sitting in trenches watching their Russian counterparts? The realities of this, I think, start to get really a bit problematic. So while it seems to me that there's an enormous amount that's very unlovely about the current situation, as far as the Western Europeans are concerned, they get quite a nice free ride at the expense of the United States. I'm surprised in a way that the US is actually willing to pick up the tab for this one, and I would expect, with the passing of time, for the US to itself take more of an isolationist move, and for the responsibility of looking after itself to be placed a bit more firmly on Western Europe. But it then would require the Western European governments actually to bite the bullet and consider what realistically they would do in terms of meeting the enormous cost of defense that this would impose on them.
Let's go down to the Gulf Coast. Pensacola, Florida. You're on the air.
Yes, let me get something straight, and then I'll ask my question.
Okay.
The Labour Party, we read a lot about the communists in Great Britain. The Labour Party and the Communist Party, is that the same? A quick yes or no, and then I'll ask a question.
No.
I was glad Jeremy said, you might not have believed it if I had done. No, by no means the same. No. Historic enemies, very daggers drawn.
Too. Who do the communists belong to? What party in England?
Well, it's a rather recondite consideration, but I can tell you that until the Communist Party contested this election, as it has every election in Britain since the war, getting a total, I think, of about 50,000 votes. I think it's ever done better than that. It had a couple of MPs in 1945. It's never had any since. In the last few years, the British Communist Party has split in two over the question of its relationship to the Soviet Union. And I don't think that those two will long survive. I think actually the epoch of the Communist Party in Britain is pretty much over.
Sure. Go ahead, then we're going to go to a clip.
Sure. What I would like to emphasize is the following. While the Communist Party as an organization is quite separate from the Labour Party, many people who would have views similar to those in the Communist Party are members, and indeed in some cases leading members of the Labour Party. It was historically the case, say just after the Second World War, that the Labour Party was particularly keen to systematically root out people who not exactly people who held such views, but certainly people who were suspected of membership of communist parties or other forms of organized Marxist groupings. There has been a decided weakening on this particular point within the Labour Party. Kinnock has himself rallied against the so-called militant tendency, which is a large grouping within the Labour Party who I think can be pretty reliably identified as members of a particular Trotskyist political party. I mean, they themselves would claim that they're no such thing, but I think that's pretty clear. What is striking is that while a number of people on the right of the Labour Party, and while to a certain extent Kinnock himself identified with the wish to do something about this, a good number of very senior people within the Labour Party now take the view that such tendencies within the Labour Party are completely legitimate and that it's not appropriate that any action should be taken against them. So that in this kind of respect, and I don't think that I'm being unfairly partisan here, one can say that while to be sure there is this piffling British Communist Party, there are many people of similar views, or in some cases slightly more radically Marxist views, who are indeed members of the Labour Party, and a certain number of them have now been elected as Labour MPs.
I'd like to talk briefly about the Alliance Party, and then we're going to go to a clip. First of all, besides the Social Democrats and the Liberals, is there anyone else, did I get that right, who is in the Alliance?
No, the Alliance, as it calls itself, it isn't the Alliance Party, as you rightly say. It's just called the Alliance for Convenience. Is an electoral pact between the old Liberal Party, the historic Liberal Party of Gladstone and Asquith, if you will, that used to, in a sense, be the natural party of government and was eclipsed by Labour in the early part of the century, and the Social Democrats, who also claim to be a party, who are, in the main, people who defected from Labour, complaining of a drift to the left, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, including several former cabinet ministers.
Is this basically a marriage of convenience?
You can join either party, but you won't find that there are in any constituency where one puts up a candidate, the other will. I mean, they have a policy of running in tandem, as it were.
Let's go to that sound clip if we can now.
What was wrong, though, with the Alliance campaign, do you think?
Well, I'm not sure that anything was wrong. I think the message that we put across... No, well, you must obviously learn lessons from campaigns, but it's not always. I mean, the main question is, what was right with the Conservative message? Why does that still manage to hold up? I think the answer is that we didn't come through strong enough to give people confidence to leave the Conservatives. And that's been the problem, that they have clung on. There must be many Conservative voters who haven't exactly liked what Conservative government has been doing, and yet fear or a variety of things has not allowed them to come and vote for us, nor indeed in sufficient numbers for the Labour Party. Neither of us have done well.
Are you personally now prepared to consider a merger with the Liberals?
Well, this is a matter for the members of the party to determine.
But you personally?
I'm a Democrat. Our party is the most democratic party it's ever been in this country, and we have one member, one vote, ballot arrangements, and it will be discussed. I don't think myself you should hurry into decisions, immediate solutions. It may appear that that solves all your problems. It also creates many problems. So I don't think by any means that at this stage one should make any firm decision, except to say it's a perfectly legitimate debate which is bound to go on, And in our party, it will be discussed at our Council for Social Democracy, and it will, in all probability, go to a vote.
What's your assessment of that statement?
Of his statement? Well, the Alliance certainly haven't done very well. In part, I think it was the fault of the leaders of the Alliance. That's to say that they got into a mess about their own views on defense policy. There was also an ambiguity as to if they had come into position either of getting an absolute majority themselves or of being in a position to form some sort of coalition government with one of the other parties as to who would have taken the lead between Owen and Steele. They were also hit, it seems to me, on this particular occasion by the sort of sell that was given by the Labour Party to Neil Kinnock. That's to say, if one looks back, the time at which the Social Democrats left the Labour Party was one in which it looked very much as if increasing power was falling into the hands of the fairly strong left-wing people in the Labour Party, and in which also a lot more power was being given to the local activists in the various different parliamentary constituencies, as opposed to the way in which things had worked before, which is that things had been settled essentially by the leader and by the parliamentary Labour Party, who were much more to the right. What happened with the particular sell that was given this time to the Labour Party was that Kinnock was emphasised. He indeed has been in a position to exercise, at least for the time being, a bit more authority in the party, such that the very thing that had led those people to go out of the Labour Party was now not in any very obvious way there. Also, they did this really rather nice movie with Kinnock frolicking across the cliffs, which certainly looked as attractive as seeing these two leaders of the Alliance looking, I think, increasingly seedy as time went on. So, in a way, the immediate attraction, particularly of David Owen, who was seen very much as taking British politics in a rather self-consciously American direction. The impact of that really was lost in favour of the particular sort of campaign that the Labour Party ran.
My fellow countrymen and women, my fellow Britons, I think can just tell an opportunist when they see one, and when they see two, they can tell two opportunists. And it's one thing to be one, but it's another to look so much like one, as Owen and Steele both do. And there was an occasion on which they both appeared on the box and were being interviewed, looking like Tweedledum and Tweedledee, and actually looking a bit more like Abbott and Costello. As a matter of fact. The interviewer asked a very proper question of them, which is, which party of the other two main parties do you most consider your rival, which you most dislike? And Steele was opening his mouth to say the Tories, and David Owen said Labour because of their defence policy. And Steele just sort of shut his mouth and sank back. Well, that's preposterous. If Owen's answer is correct, I can tell him and tell you, I mean, there is no room for two Tory parties in Britain. We've already got a very, very big one as it is, and very Tory too.
Let's get on El Paso, Texas. You're on.
Yes, sir. I think that the economic problems facing the UK and the US are caused primarily by the competitive prowess of Japan and the Pacific Basin. Do you favor London putting pressure on Washington in allowing those Asian countries to begin footing the bill and taking financial responsibility for their own national defenses?
Thank you.
I think that when we take the full measure of the disaster that has been the Reagan presidency, we'll be spoiled for choice as to decide which was the stupidest long-run thing that he did. But among them, high on the list will have to be inaugurating a trade war with Japan while trying to urge them to remilitarize. One or the other, sir, but not both. It's going to have the most profoundly horrible consequences. It would be utterly wrong for Europe to have any part of such an insane policy.
Jeremy?
Yes, if I can just comment briefly. First of all, I think that it is most important that one doesn't move towards protectionism. It seems to me that in Japanese products and in certain of the features of Japanese management, from these we've all gained immensely. And I think it would just be extremely short-sighted if we were to attempt to exclude them from our markets. In terms of the assuming the cost of defense, That's a difficult one. I mean, certainly given the misgivings about Japan that still seem to be a very real matter in the Far East, I think that it wouldn't be a very welcome suggestion to consider that they should rearm. Defense costs, possibly, but I think that the important lesson really is that we should be learning is that we should be keeping our markets open and that we should be willing to learn and to imitate, as indeed the Japanese have done, so that we in turn can top their achievements as they did earlier some of ours.
Burbank, Illinois, you're on.
Hi, I got cut off before. I was wondering about the Reagan-Thatcher chronology on the Falkland Islands and the Grenada thing. I know that we invaded Grenada with 5,000 tough troops and beat up on 600 or so Cuban construction workers that Margaret Thatcher had hired to build an airstrip for the Concorde. I think is probably the case. And the reason we invaded Grenada was because of the killing of 241 Marines in Lebanon. And then Margaret was upset about that, so Reagan called her up and said, "Don't worry about it. The American taxpayers will pay for the airport. And also, would you be interested in blowing up some sheep down there in the Falklands? And, you know, for another little PR stunt." I was just wondering if my chronology is right or wrong.
Wrong, though I think I like your mind. No, I mean, wrong, and not just in chronology. I was in Grenada at the time, and the airport was being built, indeed, with Cuban construction workers at the request of the Grenadian government, which needed an international airport which the United States government didn't think it ought to be allowed to have, because it said it could be used for military aircraft, and proved the point by landing military aircraft on it and overthrowing the Grenadian government. Or rather, to be absolutely exact, overthrowing the people who'd overthrown the Grenadian government. That was sometime after the Falklands. There was a British objection, in really a matter of amour propre to that invasion, because Grenada is a member of the Commonwealth. Its head of state is Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. And it was felt that the British should at least have been told if the American force was going to be used in such a country. The response to that complaint was to say, well, we helped you out over the Falklands, didn't we? Which was really a non sequitur answer. And wasn't really true, because actually if President Reagan hadn't encouraged General Galtieri and his fascist dictatorship in Argentina to believe that it could get away with anything while Reagan was in power, in return for its helping the death squad movement in Nicaragua known as the Contras, which it was doing, they wouldn't have ever mustered the arrogance to invade the Falklands in the first place, and we'd all have been spared a great deal of trouble.
I think there were Britons, though, involved in the construction of the airport, I think in the control tower and putting in some systems.
It is true to say that the Grenadian government, which was representing a very underdeveloped country indeed, had foreign aid from Holland, from Switzerland, from Belgium, France, but the crucial matter there was that the Cuban involvement in volunteer labor to build the airport.
Jeremy?
Yes, I recall being in the US just after the British invasion of the Falkland Islands, and I was attending actually a talk being given by the American economist Murray Rothbard, and we got onto some of these matters. And I suggested in the end that possibly the best move that Reagan could make to assure re-election would be to persuade the Cubans to land on Ellis Island and then ceremonially expel them. I didn't believe at the time that someone might have been listening to this and thus putting the US up to this business in Grenada.
We've heard so far from the Alliance, from the Labour Party, and now it's time to hear from the Conservative Party. If we could have that clip now.
What are the policies particularly, do you think, that have attracted people to the Conservatives once again, apparently?
The strength of the economy, our openness about our proposals in contrast to the deceit of the Labour Party, and the way in which the Labour Party was caught out time and time again trying to conceal its policies, and eventually, of course, the incidents of one particular Labour shadow minister becoming very abusive when he was caught out.
You think that incident, you're referring to that with Mr. Healy, are you? That Mr. Healy's incident on TVAM may have had a real effect on the poll?
Well, I think it just sharpened the point that we were making, that there is a great element of deceit and hypocrisy in the Labour Party. It underlined it.
What about the position of Mrs. Thatcher? What would you say was her contribution to this success, bearing in mind how much has been made of her position as leader and as the person for whom people vote or don't?
Well, I think she and I and our colleagues and all the Conservative Party workers in the country made it between us. And I think that's the right way to look at it. A team effort. She led it, and the rest of us backed her up. And the voters so far on these indications seem to have given her a vote of approval.
Chris, you agree with that assessment?
More than I'd like, because I find Tebbit a uniquely detestable character. I wish I had the local knowledge to be sure of what he means by the Dennis Healey incident, and Jeremy may know, but I can imagine what it must be. It must be that Dennis Healey, who is spokesman for foreign and defence policy for the Labour Party, is known not to be as keen on disarmament as Kinnock is, and I expect that kind of came out. The truth is that I think Labour did rather try and run a non-political campaign. Tried to run without taking any of the sharp issues directly, where they might hurt or might pinch or might reveal party splits, did tell people to vote Kinnock rather than vote Labour, and found that there is a sort of scepticism in the electorate that doesn't respond to that, that knows when it's being given a soft sell. Probably would have done no worse to run on a left programme honestly than to be suspected of having one and pretending not to.
If I could comment on that. It seems to me, taking up Tebbit's point, that if one asks what really in Britain has contributed to the strength of the economy, I think that the big achievement of the present Thatcher government has been to check the power of the British trade unions, which had had a particularly conservative force, which would represent a particularly conservative force in the sense of making innovation difficult and of really making it very, very difficult for management to manage, for investment to go into areas that were profitable, and for Britain really to respond to changes elsewhere in the world economy. The problem concerning the Labour Party, and in a sense what I think that people in Britain may have considered to be the hidden question, or the one that didn't really come out, is whether the Labour Party, if it had got back into power, was really intending to restore to the British trade union movement not only the privileges that had been removed from that trade union movement by the Conservative Party, but also added power in terms of an ability to have a big say in the direction in which investment in industry would go in Britain. The problem is really this, that to talk about rights for workers is really extremely attractive. To complain about the poor record of British companies in investing in capital in Britain is again, a very striking point to be made. The difficulty really is that the British trade union movement has I think it would be difficult to get anyone much to disagree, has really been an extremely unhelpful force in terms of Britain's responses to changes in the world, but that the Labour Party, because of its extremely close ties to the trade union movement, in fact historically having been really the creature of the trade union movement, couldn't, if re-elected, but I think make considerable concessions to what the leaders of the British trade unions wanted, and I think that in this manner, what I guess most people would see as really an enormously important contribution that the present Conservative government has made, that would really be dissipated.
Let's go to Vail, Colorado. You're on.
Good evening. My question, gentlemen, was regarding the policies of the Labour Party. It strikes me that over the last few years they don't really appear to have had any. Would you agree with this?
Well, I just finished saying that I thought they tried to run an unpolitical presidential type campaign. So I'd grant your point to that extent, or the implied point of your question, but it's not the allegation most commonly made. The allegation most commonly made against them is that they're too much encumbered with policies that are too specifically identifiable by the voters and are thought to be policies that, in the case of the trade unions, are condemned by history, i.e. an antiquarian attachment to an old form of trade unionism. Or in the case of defense, arouse the concern, groundless in my opinion, that without nuclear weapons Britain wouldn't be defendable or defended. But these are the policies and these are the reasons why Labour tried to run a non-political campaign. Don't think it would justify you in saying that they didn't have any, however.
I'd like to briefly just switch to British television. There are no paid political advertisements allowed on?
No.
They're only 4 weeks in the campaign.
Yeah, have to be a minimum of 3.5 weeks, I think it is.
So what is coverage like?
Well, it's saturation, but it's subject to what's known by the BBC and others as a balance rule. If you interview on your BBC News Bulletin the leader of the Labour Party, you've got to have equal time for the leader of the Tory Party. It's been complicated by the presence of a third party which contains two parties, but in some proportion to support, in their case, they get equal time too. You can't buy TV time for politics. Your election address, each candidate's own manifesto in his or her own constituency is given out free twice, once when the campaign begins and once on eve of poll. So there's no money to be spent on enlightenment that way. All these are reforms that, as you can see, are urgently needed in the United States.
I understand there's a great emphasis, too, on polls.
Lately, yes.
Yes. Is there any way to get away from that? I know that's a complaint you hear in the United States, that reporters don't want to talk about issues. They want to talk about polls, and that question keeps coming up in news conferences. How do you get away from that?
Well, one way in which you might start to get away from it is by reflecting on the accuracy of the polls most recently. I mean, we're in a situation where the Conservative Party has picked up a majority of over 100. Where no one expected that, especially those people who are being guided by the polls. One has also got the gradual emergence in Britain of a great deal of patchiness in terms of response. I mean, that's to say, even from an overall knowledge of what the percentage of the votes was that the Conservatives have picked up, the Labour Party have picked up, and so on, it was extremely difficult to make predictions. What this then means is that one gets polls going for much more particular preferences, and especially going for what may be important factors in particular marginal seats. I'm not sure, though, that would have the same, I mean, that would be watched with great care, and certainly is watched with great care by the people who are planning the campaigns for the political parties. It wouldn't, I think, be quite as newsworthy in terms of the media. So if, unless the polls in a way can get their own act together a little bit better, one may, I guess, in the end get a certain de-emphasis on their importance.
Let's go to Baltimore, Maryland. You're on.
Yes, I'd just like to get down to the average person in Britain. What chance is a young person coming out of, say, I'll just use an American example, say a secondary high school, have of learning a trade and earning a decent living, so maybe in the future he can support a family and so on, just, you know, to live comfortably? That's my only question. As to, you know, before Mrs. Thatcher's been in office and after.
Thank you.
I wouldn't like to say that their chances of such a person have been greatly reduced by Thatcher, because it's been a notorious thing in Britain that where you're born and to whom makes too much difference to your life chance. And that's been a criticism of our country for a long time. I wouldn't say Thatcher made it any better. And it's very noticeable that the 3.5 million or so people currently unemployed, which is to say roughly 11 to 12% of the workforce, are either people who are from aging industries which nobody knows what to do about, or from the school-leaving bracket. That's to say, either people who will never work again, or people who've never had a job yet. And those are the two things that make it such a depressing problem. It's not a seasonal or cyclical unemployment, you see. It's becoming a permanent, workless underclass. And that was Labour's big attempted theme in the campaign, and though it didn't work, it won't go away as a question.
Jeremy?
It's certainly tough on people in such a situation. If they're living in London and the southeast, they can probably get employment. They're going to face many more difficulties in finding somewhere that they can afford to live. If they're in northern cities, particularly those which have had a tradition of large-scale manufacturing employment, then the situation is extremely tough. The Conservative Party has put an enormous amount of effort into various kinds of youth training schemes, and they now have moved to a situation where they're guaranteeing people vacation-related training for a couple of years after leaving school for anyone who can't otherwise get employment. What does one do? Say more effort is to be put into that? It's a mighty difficult situation. I mean, just because one is faced in such people with competition, certainly in many of their traditional forms of employment that they might have looked to, with the developing economies who in many cases have moved into just those areas where in the previous generation these young people would have been employed. All I'd say about it...
it's more of a problem if you're a government that believes that unemployment is a good thing because it can be used to discipline the trade unions and the wage earners, and that therefore that the threat of the dole queue will discipline the labour market and uses that as the main instrument of disciplining the labour market. That's not a government saying, what do we do about unemployment? That's a government saying, we want enough unemployment to be able to do this.
Do you think that if Mrs. Thatcher could, she would not have produced for this election a really radical decline in unemployment figures?
I'll take the corollary and say that, yes, they tried for the election, to use your own words, to bring the figures down, mainly by creative bookkeeping. But I will say that the original creation of unemployment was in large measure conscious and deliberate. Yes, it was a means. It was the means by which they did something you were just praising, which was bring the trade unions under control.
I'd like to add one other thing. 3 blacks were elected to Parliament. I understand this is a first.
I was just about to say, and it's even worse if you're young and black. Much higher chance of getting unemployed. Yeah, it's not a first historically, because there were a couple of Indians in the 20s, including a man called Behram Saklatvala, who, as well as being the first Indian and the first Parsi, was also the first communist ever elected to the British House of Commons. Other than that, this is a first, yes, all Labour, I think all in London.
Yes, that's right. The Tories
can claim to have had the first Jewish Prime Minister, the first bachelor Prime Minister, and the first female Prime Minister. So their record isn't that bad, but it'll go hard for them to get any serious black candidate. They've made too many appeals to racial prejudice, in either subliminally or directly in the past, to attract the constituency necessary.
If I can come in on that, I wouldn't be at all surprised to see Asian Tory MPs fairly soon. I mean, there are a number of people who are contesting seats
it's a minor disgrace that a party with the ability to elect MPs that the Conservative Party hasn't done that already. I repeat, the fact is not enough black and brown people will vote Tory because they know very well that the Conservative appeal has been venomously opposed to the settlement of black and brown people in Britain.
We are almost out of time. I'd like to take at least one more call. San Rafael, California, you're on.
Hello. I have 2 questions, one to do with devolution and the other one to do with the future of the Labour Party. The first one to do with devolution is, it would seem to me this election has proved that the United Kingdom is no longer that. And does that not seem to suggest there is a need for some kind of limited devolution for both Scotland and Wales? The second question to do with the future of the Labour Party is, do you think that there's going to be a serious disintegration of the Parliamentary Labour Party, with a lot of votes going to the SDP and the Labour Alliance, and the mainstream Labour going further and further to the left?
If I can come in on this to start off with, the United Kingdom no longer united. Certainly the Tories have done particularly badly in Scotland, although that's in some ways to be explained by the very particular quality of the Conservative Party in Scotland, where, to put it bluntly, they tended to put up the younger, the sort of second son of a local laird or a merchant banker from London, and where particularly, I suppose, the middle-class, slightly aggressive style of the Thatcher government and of those people who've been attracted to it has just rubbed the Scots up the wrong way. In my view, things certainly, I mean, things have obviously gone very badly. I would have thought that that's more a matter of rethinking for the Conservative Party in Scotland than something which is a complete write-off. Devolution, it's difficult. I mean, for a supporter of the Conservative Party, in some ways it's extremely tempting on the grounds that if there was devolution in Scotland and Wales, then Britain, there would hardly be any point in having further elections in England, on the grounds that there'd be a perpetual Conservative majority. In terms of the dissolution of the Parliamentary Labour Party, I would have thought not. I would have thought that things are likely to stay pretty much as they are, maybe slightly modestly over time increases in the influence of some of the more radical elements in the party, but when it comes to an election, there'll be increasing need to produce either Kinnock or a sort of slightly smartened up version of Kinnock with a bit more hair and possibly a little younger and sort of dancing over the cliffs as a bit, no, not over the cliffs, but dancing across the cliffs as opposed just to walking. Chris?
It's true that Tories are as rare as rocking horse droppings in Scotland and Wales, but that's always been true. And devolution, you can't derive devolution from that. You either think that Scotland and Wales are, could be states as well as nations, or you don't. And I think it's a foolish belief. The area, or province, you might say, of the kingdom that Jeremy didn't mention was Ulster, where I'm not quite certain what the results were, but where there is now an extraordinary disaffection from central government by the Conservative voters, who are, in this case, the Orange Ulster Unionists and Protestants. And I think their disaffection from the Conservative cause is now pretty much complete.
But Conservative
that might be the one to watch.
Conservative only in a very particular sense. I mean, they're conservative in the sense of keeping up to their own traditions. They're conservative in the sense that there was an earlier alliance with the Conservatives. But I think surely you'd agree that that both of the traditions in Northern Ireland are in a way utterly foreign to anything to be found in mainland England, although there are certain echoes, particularly in the politics of the west of Scotland.
Well, Ireland is another country. It's a recognition we've yet to come to.
Also, though, in terms of Scotland, it does seem to me that one mustn't put Scotland on a par with Wales, because there's the different Scottish legal traditions, the different, very different and distinctive culture in Scotland. Is something which I think it would certainly be possible to think of as having a much greater degree of autonomy, if not independence. Whereas if one looks at Wales, a large sections of Wales are completely anglicised, and the Welsh nationalists themselves are mostly operating in rural backwaters then.
Jeremy Shearmer, we're out of time. By very quickly. Christopher Hitchens, thank you very much for being here. We'd like to give a special thanks to the BBC, George Mason University out here in Fairfax, Virginia, and Capital Connection for providing us with election night coverage. Thank you. Good night.
Join us Sunday evenings on C-SPAN for another 90-minute viewer call-in program. We call it Process and Policy, a look at current issues in Washington and an exploration of how policy surrounding those issues is made. Process and Policy, live every Sunday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. Pacific.